The fluorescent lights hummed like they were apologizing for something. Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland existed in that particular kind of silence that only hospitals managed, the kind where every sound meant something. A ventilator wheezed somewhere down the corridor. A monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm from the cardiac unit. Rachel Torres moved through it all like a ghost, restocking the ICU medication cart at 3 in the morning, her movements precise and economical. She'd been a temp nurse here for 92 days. She counted. The scrubs hung loose on her frame. She'd been heavier once, back when her ribs didn't show like a xylophone through hospital-thin cotton. Back when she could walk without favoring her left side. Back when she wore a rank that meant something other than just a nurse. She reached for the next set of 4 bags, her hand steady as a surgical laser, each movement practiced enough to be invisible. That was the point. Invisible worked. Beneath her scrubs, against the hollow of her throat, she wore a dog tag on a broken chain. Single tag. Michael's tag. She touched it the way other people touched crosses or prayer beads, not consciously, just habit worn smooth by 18 months of repetition. Her son's name. His service number. The blood type he'd never need anymore because the IED in Marjah had made blood type irrelevant. The night charge nurse, Denise, appeared at the medication cart with a folder and that particular expression nurses developed when they were about to hand someone a shift assignment that would change the trajectory of their evening. Denise had kind eyes. Too kind for what she was about to say. "We've got an admission coming up from the ER," Denise said, her voice kept low in that way that meant the information mattered. VIP status. Lieutenant Commander Jason Hayes. Navy SEAL. Traumatic complications from an old injury, Marjah Theatre, about 18 months ago. Wound dehiscence, possible infection. Dr. Ashford's already been notified. Rachel's hand stopped on the medication cart. The world didn't freeze exactly. Time didn't actually alter. But something inside her did that thing it did sometimes, the thing where breath became a conscious decision rather than an automatic function. Marjah. 18 months ago. Michael's theatre. Michael's timeline. Michael's? One measured breath. She'd gotten good at those. "Okay," Rachel said, and her voice was exactly the same as it had been 5 seconds earlier, which was to say it was flat and polite and the voice of someone who moved through hospitals like she was reading from a script someone else had written. "What bed?" "ICU 7, Denise said. "He's stable for now, but Ashford's concerned about sepsis. They're running labs. Should be here within the hour." Denise paused, and Rachel felt the weight of whatever came next before her coworker spoke it. "You knew him, didn't you?" "In theater." The medication cart made a sound like a chair scraping when Rachel moved it forward. She didn't turn around. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects caught in glass. When she spoke, the words came out in the order she'd learned to say them when people asked about her medical discharge, about the spine surgery, about the 2 years of physical therapy that had meant learning to walk again like a child discovering gravity for the first time. "I was medical support," Rachel said. "Different unit." It was technically true. It was also the kind of truth that contained several other truths in the way that lies sometimes did. She'd been medical support. She'd been at Forward Operating Base Shank. She'd been 30 kilometers from Marjah when the IED had gone off. And she'd been the surgeon who'd written the casualty report for Petty Officer 2nd Class Michael Torres when the medevac couldn't save what was already gone. Her son. "He's got 3 Purple Hearts," Denise said quietly, and Rachel could hear the respect in her voice, the way people talked about the decorated ones. "The citations are classified, but his reputation precedes him. Holloway's team leader for SEAL Team 3. They call him Iron Man when he's not in the room and commander to his face." Rachel finished stocking the cart. She'd learned how to finish things in the middle of emotional earthquakes. It was a skill nobody put on resumes. "I'll prepare the room," she said. The ICU at Sacred Heart was a place designed for observation. Glass walls on 3 sides meant that anyone passing could see into the critical care spaces, could watch the machines that kept people alive do their mathematics of blood pressure and oxygen saturation and cardiac rhythm. Rachel walked past the nursing station where the night team worked their quiet choreography, monitor strips printing, nurses charting, the resident reviewing labs with the intensity of someone trying to see the future in numbers. She prepared ICU 7 with the ritual precision of someone who'd done it 400 times before. She checked the suction canister. She verified the oxygen flow rates. She ran saline through the 4 lines and ensured the monitors had clear electrode pads ready. 12-lead EKG machine at the ready. Crash cart 2 doors down. Defibrillator pads in the drawer. Everything in its place like a soldier's field kit, organized so that in the dark, under fire, your hands could find what they needed without your eyes. She didn't think about the last time she'd worked on Jason Hayes. She didn't think about the forward operating base or the heat like a physical weight or the way his hands had shaken when they told him about Michael. She definitely didn't think about the moment he'd pressed Michael's dog tag into her palm at the funeral, his voice hollow as a pipe, "He wanted you to have it. Said if anything happened, you'd understand. Said you'd know what to do." Rachel had known what to do. She'd held that dog tag and she'd gotten into her apartment alone and she'd sat on the floor of her shower with the water running hot enough to hurt and she'd finally let herself break in a way she hadn't broken since the day the chaplain arrived at her house in 2011. But that was later. That was private. Right now, she was a temp nurse at Sacred Heart, and a Navy SEAL was being admitted to her unit, and the universe had developed a sense of irony that felt distinctly personal. The admission rolled in at 03 for 7 hours. She heard the ambulance bay doors open from where she stood at the medication cart, heard the precise tone of the paramedics giving report to the ER team. Stable vitals. Wound assessment concerning. Patient alert and oriented. Cooperative. The kind of report that made Hayes sound like a thing rather than a person, which was the entire point of trauma medicine. You reduced humans to systems, to numbers, to physiological parameters that your brain could actually process without shutting down. It was another 38 minutes before they rolled him into ICU 7. He came through the glass doors like he occupied more space than his body should have been able to hold, not because he was large, though he was, but because of the way he moved. Even sedated, even compromised by injury, there was an efficiency to his motion that marked him as someone who had trained his body until it forgot how to be anything other than a weapon. He wore a hospital gown because the ER had put him in one, but the gown on Jason Hayes looked like a costume he was pretending to believe in. His left shoulder and upper arm were wrapped in surgical dressings, the wrapping already spotted with seepage despite the secondary layers they'd added. He's been on 4 antibiotics since ER arrival, the transport nurse said, handing Rachel the chart. Temperature's been trending up. Last reading was 38.4 Celsius. They want cultures sent, CBC with differential, complete metabolic panel, and a repeat wound assessment in 4 hours. Ashford's concerned about necrotizing fasciitis, so watch for any deterioration in the surrounding tissue. Rachel nodded. She took the vital signs from the transport monitor and transferred them to Sacred Heart system with the practiced efficiency of someone whose brain could do this work while the rest of her attention operated on an entirely different frequency. His heart rate was 96. Blood pressure 138/84. Oxygen saturation 97% on room air, which meant his lungs had better discipline than most people. His temperature was indeed elevated. His chart noted that he'd been injured 18 months ago, that the wound had healed, that he'd been cleared for full duty, and that the presentation of infection at this late stage suggested either re-injury or an unusual organism. She didn't look at his face. She ran the 4 lines. She checked that the monitor leads were making good contact with his skin. She pulled the blanket up to his shoulders. Hospital blankets were thin, and people healing from trauma needed warmth like they needed oxygen, and she was reaching for the clipboard when something in the quality of the air changed. His eyes opened. They were grey like winter clouds over the Puget Sound, and they focused on her with the immediate clarity of someone trained to assess threats in the darkness. For 1 second, just one, the length of a heartbeat, she felt genuinely exposed. But she was used to that feeling. She'd been exposing the minimum amount of herself necessary for almost 2 years. "Your hands," he said. His voice was rough with sedation and anesthesia, but it carried the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "They are steady." It wasn't a question. Rachel didn't answer questions that weren't questions. Instead, she finished documenting his vitals on the chart, her movements unchanged. "That's good," he continued, his eyes still tracking her. "Steady hands matter. Someone once told me the difference between a good medic and a great one was whether they could keep their hand steady when everything else was falling apart." He paused, and she could feel him trying to organize thoughts through the pharmaceutical fog they'd given him in the ER. "Where do I know your hands from?" Rachel set the clipboard on the foot rail. She could have said anything. She could have deflected. She could have mentioned that a lot of people learned to keep their hands steady. But the word that came out instead was different from what she'd planned. "Luck," she said quietly. His eyes closed after that. The sedation or the pain or the simple mercy of exhaustion pulled him back under. Within 90 seconds, his breathing deepened into the rhythm of someone genuinely unconscious, and Rachel stood at the foot of his bed in the humming fluorescence of the ICU and touched her son's dog tag beneath her scrubs, and let herself feel exactly nothing at all. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. That moment came 17 minutes later. Rachel was in the medication supply room, counting controlled substances, documentation that Ashford insisted upon with an intensity that made some of the other nurses exchange glances, when Dr. Ashford himself appeared in the doorway. He was a tall man with the kind of posture that came from believing deeply in his own importance. His white coat had creases sharp enough to cut with, and his wedding ring was a platinum band that caught the fluorescent light like it was trying to send messages to satellites. "Torres," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who'd decided in advance that whatever conversation they were about to have would go exactly the way they'd planned. "The SEAL in 7. You knew him in theater." It wasn't a question. "I was medical support," Rachel said, continuing her count. "Morphine syringe. Fentanyl patch. Hydromorphone tablet." The words came out like she was reading inventory rather than lying. "Small world," Ashford said. He moved deeper into the supply room, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that tried to cover the underlying scent of hand sanitizer and that particular staleness that doctors accumulated when they spent their lives in climate-controlled environments with recycled air. "He's going to need very careful management. Sepsis protocols. Wound management. The kind of care that requires absolute adherence to chain of command." Rachel set down the inventory tablet. She turned to face him. Dr. Ashford was the kind of person who interpreted politeness as weakness, so she'd learned not to offer much of either in his direction. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" His smile was the smile of someone who'd never had his authority questioned in any meaningful way. "Because from where I'm standing, a temp nurse with questionable military experience might get confused about whose orders matter and whose don't. Military people sometimes develop loyalty complications. Conflicting protocols." He paused, and she could see him enjoying whatever he thought came next. "I'll need to know that won't be an issue." The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarm sounded for approximately 8 seconds before someone silenced it. Rachel had learned to read the subtext of people like Dr. Ashford, men who needed to feel powerful because they were terrified of being exposed as ordinary. He was warning her. He was establishing dominance. He was telling her that he knew something about her situation and that he planned to use it. "It won't be an issue," Rachel said. Her voice didn't change. It remained flat and professional and exactly the voice of a temp nurse with a limp and a medical discharge and no one at home waiting for her to come back. Ashford nodded, satisfied. "Good. Because I'm going to be very involved in Hayes's care. Very involved indeed. And I expect absolute precision from everyone on this unit. No independent decisions. No shortcuts. No assumptions that military experience trumps hospital policy." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway like he'd thought of something witty and wanted to deliver it. "You're a good worker, Torres. Let's keep it that way." After he left, Rachel finished the controlled substance count. She documented everything. She signed the verification forms. She moved through the medication supply room like she was performing a ballet she'd choreographed decades ago. By the time she walked back to the ICU, she was looking at monitor 7, at Hayes's steady cardiac rhythm, his oxygen saturation holding at 97%, his temperature still trending upward toward fever, and she was thinking about what Ashford had meant by watching, by involvement, by the particular tone a man used when he was establishing a territory he intended to defend. He didn't know who Rachel Torres was. And that was precisely the point. The night shift at Sacred Heart moved like a held breath. 2 in the morning. The kind of dark where the fluorescent lights above the ICU seemed to press down harder, casting everything in the color of old bones. Rachel moved through the cardiac wing with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, not the nursing, though she'd done plenty of that, but the vigilance. The constant assessment. In Marjah, you learn to see what others missed. A shadow in the wrong place. The weight distribution of a backpack that didn't match its owner's stride. A syringe in a doctor's hand at 2 in the morning, when no rounds were scheduled, when the medication room was locked, when nobody was watching. She'd been walking past the executive suite on her way to deliver lab results to the morning team when she saw it. The cracked door. Dr. Ashford inside in surgical gloves under the pale glow of a desk lamp, his movements precise as a metronome. On the steel cart before him sat 5-4 bags, sodium chloride drips with patient names affixed to the labels. Cardiac unit assignments. Ashford held a syringe, needle gleaming, and drew from a small brown bottle with no label. No pharmacy markings. No patient information. He injected the unlabeled substance into the first bag with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Once. Twice. 3 times in 2 separate bags, each injection methodical, each followed by the careful placement of the syringe into a sharps container beneath the desk. He filled out no paperwork. Added no notes to any chart. He simply sealed the bags into a sterile transport container, peeled off his gloves, and turned toward the door. Rachel kept walking. Same pace. Same trajectory. Same breathing pattern she'd maintained for 18 months while her hands learned how to shake a tremor into stillness and her voice learned how to sound like a temp nurse instead of the major who'd spent 2 years in Walter Reed learning how to walk again. She delivered the labs to the morning shift, routine, unremarkable, then looped back through the service corridor, the long way, the way that didn't pass the executive suite. Her heart was moving like she was in a firefight again, but her hand stayed steady. Her face stayed blank. That was the thing about combat training. It didn't leave you. It nested in your nervous system like shrapnel and waited for reasons to activate. The next morning, she was called to the director of nursing's office. Sandra Chen, a woman Rachel had never spoken to beyond a greeting, sat behind a desk with the posture of someone delivering information, not having a conversation. We're moving you to float pool, effective immediately. I'm sorry. Staffing needs. The assignment was always temporary. You'll receive assignment calls based on unit census. No eye contact. No discussion. No mention of the executive suite, the unlabeled syringes, or why she was being reassigned off the ICU where she'd been scheduled for 3 more weeks. Rachel opened her mouth to say something about what she'd seen, but Sandra's phone buzzed and the conversation was already over. She'd been dismissed with the kind of finality that suggested the decision wasn't hers to question. By that afternoon, Rachel's badge wouldn't access the medication room. The electronic lock beeped 3 times, access denied, and when she asked the charge nurse about it, Linda wouldn't meet her eyes. IT is working on it. System error. When do you think they'll fix it? Linda's phone rang. One finger held up that became 5 minutes of Rachel standing in the hallway while Linda took the call 3 feet away, her back deliberately turned. When Linda finally hung up, she didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply walked away to the supply room with the casual cruelty of someone following unspoken instructions. Rachel pulled Hayes's chart that evening, the Navy SEAL still in recovery, his wound stable, his vitals trending in the right direction. But Ashford's name now appeared as consulting physician. Added overnight. No clinical indication. No documentation of the consult. Just his signature authorizing full access to all medications, all treatment decisions, all patient information. The knot in Rachel's stomach tightened. She tried to file an incident report about the unlabeled syringes. The computer system in the nursing station brought up the form, but when she tried to submit it, the screen flickered and returned a message in clinical red: access denied, insufficient credentials. She tried again. Same result. She tried from a different computer. 3 times the system rejected her. By the 3rd attempt, she understood this wasn't a glitch. This was intentional. This was Ashford controlling who could report him. That morning, Dr. Ashford appeared in the cardiac care unit while Rachel was monitoring a post-operative patient, a routine follow-up, routine vitals, the kind of work that required presence but not presence of mind. The patient's sister and brother-in-law stood by the bed looking anxious the way families did when their loved one's chest was still healing. Ashford entered with the bearing of someone entering his own domain. He didn't greet the family. He didn't introduce himself to the patient. He looked at Rachel with something that wasn't quite contempt but moved in that direction. Nurse Torres, I need to discuss a medication administration error you made yesterday. Rachel checked the chart. The patient's morning digoxin was ordered for 0800. She'd given it at 0800. The chart showed 0800. Her notes clearly documented 0800. Dr. Ashford, the order specifies. Are you contradicting me in front of this family? His voice carried a specific kind of weight, not loud, but the kind of quiet that echoes down corridors and makes people listen. Rachel could hear staff slowing their pace in the hallway outside, footsteps becoming deliberate, conversations dying to hear the rest. This is exactly the kind of incompetence we've been monitoring, Ashford continued, his tone taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering a diagnosis. Temporary nursing staff who think they understand hospital protocols better than attending physicians. It's a pattern we need to address immediately. The sister's face tightened. Her hand found her brother's shoulder. Is my brother safe with her? We're monitoring the situation very closely, Ashford said, his voice taking on something funereal. But I appreciate you bringing it to my attention. This is precisely the kind of care deviation we cannot allow. Rachel felt the heat rise in her chest, not the heat of shame or embarrassment but the combat anger, the old familiar fuel that used to keep her standing in a field hospital for 16 hours straight while mortars fell within 100 meters and her hands moved on their own and the only thing between 18 wounded Marines and the morgue was her and a trauma kit and pure refusal to stop. That anger lived in her bones like a second skeleton. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath that moved slowly, that said to her nervous system, you are not in Marjah, you are not under fire, you are going to survive this with your composure intact. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She let one tear slide down her cheek. Not from fear. Not from humiliation. From the weight of 18 months of silence and 3 months of watching her son's commanding officer like he was made of glass while she pretended to be someone she wasn't. The tear tracked slowly, a single line of release she didn't try to hide. She reached up and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Ashford. Her hand brushed the dog tag beneath her scrub top, Michael's tag, the one Hayes had pressed into her palm at the cemetery with shaking hands and the whispered apology of a man who'd lost someone under his command. One piece of evidence that Major Rachel Torres had existed, that she'd raised a son, that she'd taught him to lead with honor, that she'd failed him when it mattered most. I've seen good men die with more dignity than this, Rachel said quietly. Her voice came out steady, low, the voice of someone who'd actually seen what she was talking about. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her limp pronounced from the spinal injury that had ended her military career, her hand steady, her composure intact. Ashford's face had gone pale. The sister's hand had tightened on her brother's shoulder. Rachel could feel their eyes on her back as she left, but she didn't turn around. She didn't defend herself. She didn't cry. She simply moved through the doorway and into the hallway like someone who had nothing left to lose, because that was closer to true than anyone in that room understood. The break room was her next trap, and she walked into it at lunch without knowing it was waiting. She'd made a sandwich at home, turkey, mustard, bread, nothing elaborate, nothing that required thought. The break room held 6 nurses clustered around the small table, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical anthem, the industrial refrigerator cycling with a sound like a cough. Rachel sat down at the empty chair and opened her lunch. What happened next happened with the precision of choreography. Chairs scraped against tile in an orchestrated exit so coordinated it seemed impossible nobody had practiced it. Linda gathered her jacket. Maria grabbed her purse, suddenly remembering a dental appointment she hadn't mentioned 5 minutes earlier. Another nurse stood abruptly. "I have to call my daughter's school." Within 90 seconds, Rachel sat alone at the table, the wall clock ticking above her head like artillery fire counting down to something nobody could stop. The sandwich felt like cardboard in her mouth. She chewed anyway, because sitting there eating lunch alone was its own kind of statement. I will not be broken by silence. I will not run. I will not give him the satisfaction. By 1400 hours, her name appeared on the unit board in the main nursing station where everyone passed on their way to their assignments. White paper, black text, the kind of official notice that made people slow their pace to read it. Written warning, Torres, failure to follow chain of command, medication timing violation. Rachel stood 3 feet from the board and read her own humiliation, her face carved from stone, her hands hanging at her sides, her breathing even and measured. She read it once. Then she turned and walked back to her rounds without a word to anyone, without defending herself, without explaining, without flinching. Because flinching was what Ashford wanted. Flinching was surrender. And Rachel Torres had learned a long time ago that the quietest people in the room were sometimes the most dangerous. The morning shift change brought the kind of controlled chaos that made hospitals feel alive, monitors beeping their steady conversations, shoes clicking across tile floors in a rhythm older than memory. Rachel pulled on her float badge, the one that meant she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once, and felt the weight of it like a target painted on her chest. They'd reassigned her overnight. The message came through at 0600 hours in an email from nurse scheduling, Torres, Rachel, float position, ICU, all shifts. Coverage for breaks and lunch relief. Assignment, general rotation. Not Hayes's primary nurse. Not a care coordinator. A floater. Someone who passed through rooms like a ghost, present but not responsible, helpful but not essential. The ICU corridor smelled like antiseptic layered over something older, the particular scent of bodies healing and bodies failing, a mixture that never quite washed out of the walls. Rachel walked the length of it, her sneakers silent on the linoleum, and saw him through the glass partition of room for 12. Lieutenant Commander Jason Hayes. Elevated 60 degrees, chest dressing clean, cardiac monitor showing a rhythm steady as a metronome. 72 hours until discharge. 3 days until he walked out of Sacred Heart and back into a life Rachel had nearly destroyed trying to save her son in. The 4-line ran clear. No bags being changed. No medication draws in progress. Just a man healing exactly as he should, his presence like an open wound in the center of Rachel's carefully constructed hospital identity. Ashford moved through the unit like water finding cracks, efficient, purposeful, impossible to stop. Rachel watched from the hallway as he entered Hayes's room, pulling the chart from its slot with a kind of deliberate motion that said he wanted to be seen doing it. He didn't acknowledge her. He never did anymore. That was stage 3 of the warfare, not the shouting, but the silence. The strategic silence. She saw him make notes. 3, 4, 5 deliberate strokes of his pen across the documentation page. His handwriting was small and precise, the penmanship of someone who understood that paperwork was a weapon when deployed correctly. When he exited the room, he didn't close the chart, he left it visible, a message written in medical terminology and physician authority. Rachel couldn't read the specific words from 30 feet away, but she understood the language. Every mark was a brick in the wall between her and Hayes's care. By 0900 hours, the restriction began in earnest. Rachel approached the charge nurse desk at shift change, her badge clipped to her waistband, her voice kept low and professional. I can take Hayes's primary care during the day shift. I'm already assigned to ICU coverage. The charge nurse, Sandra, who'd been kind once, before Ashford began circulating his quiet campaign, didn't look up from her computer screen. Dr. Ashford requested continuity with his selected staff. Hayes's primary is already assigned to Parker. Your float only. We need you in Bay 7 for the post-op monitoring. It wasn't a request. It was an ordering dressed in nursing speak, and Rachel recognized the syntax of institutional power being applied like pressure to a wound. Bay 7 had a post-operative hip replacement patient who needed vitals every 30 minutes for the next 4 hours. Routine work. Safe work. Work that would keep Rachel as far from room for 12 as the layout of the unit would allow. She accepted the assignment with a nod, then she moved through the unit and began to see the architecture of it all, the way Ashford had constructed an isolation grid around Hayes without appearing to do anything at all. At 1015 hours, when Rachel's assignment in Bay 7 required 15 minutes for a blood pressure recheck and documentation, she noticed Ashford had scheduled Hayes for a wound assessment at that exact moment. By 11:30 hours, when the post-op patient needed a medication drawer, Hayes's for had just been flushed. At 1245 hours, when Rachel finally had a window to check on Hayes before her lunch break, his room was blocked by a physician's assistant taking a phlebotomy sample, another test, another reason Rachel couldn't be present in that space. She sat in the break room with a turkey sandwich she couldn't taste and her phone pulled low under the table like contraband. 16 searches. Public death records from Sacred Heart's cardiology service going back 8 months. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Mrs. Eleanor Voss, 81, massive myocardial infarction despite being stable 12 hours prior. Mr. Robert Chen, 79, sudden acute pulmonary edema. Mrs. Patricia Halloway, 84, rapid decompensation and cardiac arrest. 17 names. 17 elderly patients. 17 insurance policies that probably paid out faster than anyone asked questions. All under Dr. Marcus Ashford's care. But Hayes didn't fit. Hayes was 38, military insurance, no financial profile that made him valuable as a casualty. So why the isolation? Why the careful, methodical removal of her access to his care? Rachel ran her thumb across the edge of her phone screen, thinking like a combat medic again, thinking about threat assessment and operational logic. The pattern in Hayes's case wasn't financial. It was personal. Ashford knew she'd seen him. Knew what she'd witnessed in the medication room. And perhaps, Rachel's jaw tightened at this thought, he suspected that Hayes might know who she was. A Navy SEAL doesn't forget a voice. Doesn't forget a major. The kind of commanding officer who led men into Marjah wouldn't arrive at a hospital and fail to recognize the sound of the woman who'd held his dying Marine. So Hayes became the leverage. Not a target, but a mechanism. Remove Rachel's access to his care, isolate her from the one patient who might confirm her identity, and you eliminate the only witness who could speak to what she'd seen in that medication room with authority and credibility. A nurse with a personal vendetta saw something and reported it. A major with 20 years of service who'd held the commanding officer in her arms as her son died? That was a witness who mattered. Rachel pulled up the staff directory and found the contact for Dr. Catherine Liu, one of the senior attendings who'd been kind during Rachel's first weeks at Sacred Heart. The phone rang 4 times before Liu's assistant answered. Dr. Liu's office, this is Janet. Rachel kept her voice steady, professional, the voice of a nurse with a genuine concern. Hi Janet, it's Rachel Torres from the ICU. I was hoping to speak with Dr. Liu about a clinical concern regarding patient safety protocols. When might she have a few minutes? The pause that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Janet's entire demeanor shifted. Rachel heard it in the exhale, the sudden formality that replaced friendliness. Let me check her schedule. Actually, Rachel, Dr. Liu mentioned, she asked me to let you know that Dr. Ashford shared some feedback about your recent performance issues. She said maybe it would be better to focus on your own clinical practice before raising concerns about other physicians' cases. The line went dead. Rachel set the phone on the break room table and looked at her sandwich. The turkey had gone pale and curled at the edges, the letters beginning to wilt. She hadn't eaten in 36 hours. Hadn't slept properly in 48. But what she felt in that moment wasn't hunger or exhaustion. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that came from recognizing a tactical battlefield even when it was disguised as a hospital floor. Ashford had moved from public humiliation to strategic isolation. Stage 3. He'd cut her off from Hayes, from the attending physicians, from the chain of command that might actually listen to her. He'd constructed a situation where any accusation she made would sound like retaliation for her own disciplinary issues. He'd isolated her with the precision of someone who understood institutional power the way a sniper understands wind speed and bullet drop. The evening shift started at 1,600 hours. Rachel finished her shift work, watching Hayes through the glass as another nurse, one of Ashford's select team, checked his vitals and adjusted his medications. His dressing looked clean. His color was good. He was healing exactly as he should, and she was being systematically removed from his case in a way that looked completely professional and completely calculated. At 18:45 hours, her pager buzzed. Nurse Torres to ICU med room, stat. She recognized the extension. Ashford. The medication room was empty except for him. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a kind of surgical clarity, the shelves of vials and syringes, the locked cabinet where the 4 bags were stored, and Ashford standing by the counter with his arms crossed in a posture designed to seem casual but that Rachel recognized as power redistribution. She entered and closed the door behind her. In hospitals, closed doors changed the conversation. Rachel. He smiled. Not unkindly. That was the worst part, he genuinely seemed sympathetic. I wanted to speak with you directly rather than through administration. I've made a recommendation to the Chief of Surgery. Your contract here at Sacred Heart will not be renewed. You have 30 days. I'd suggest you use them to find another position. Perhaps a smaller facility. Somewhere less demanding than a trauma center. He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. I think you'll find you're happier somewhere that matches your actual skill level. Rachel stood in that fluorescent bright room and felt the infrastructure of her carefully constructed new life crack in real time. 30 days. No recommendation. A permanent mark on her record as a temp who couldn't handle the pressure. The thing about isolation is that it compounds. The longer you're separated from your support structure, the less credible you sound when you try to rejoin it. She took one measured breath. Men like you, she said, her voice dropping into a register she hadn't used in 18 months, always underestimate women like me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was simply stated as fact. The kind of fact that comes from someone who's watched men like him operate before, in different contexts, under different flags. The kind of fact that comes from a woman who'd survived things that would have broken someone normal. Ashford laughed. An actual laugh, surprised and genuine. Oh, Rachel. That's what I'm counting on. He turned toward the door, then paused. You should probably start looking at job listings now. Give yourself a head start. He left her in that medication room, surrounded by the tools of healing, alone. Rachel's hand went to her collarbone, to the single dog tag on its broken chain beneath her scrub top. Michael's tag. The weight of it was constant now, a rhythm like a heartbeat. She touched it the way other people might touch a rosary, a talisman, a reminder of who she'd been when she had the authority to protect people. She was a major. She'd led combat medics through insurgent fire. She'd held a field hospital together through 16 hours of continuous casualties in a province where the enemy understood that killing medical personnel was strategy. But in this fluorescent bright room in Portland, Oregon, she was just a temp nurse being quietly destroyed by a man who understood the weapons available to him. The next words out of her mouth would matter. The monitor screamed 3 rooms down. Not the soft electronic beeping of steady vital signs, the wailing alarm of a chest in collapse, pressure dropping, oxygen saturation in free fall. Rachel heard it from the medication closet where she was finishing charts, and her body moved before her mind caught up. That sound. She knew that sound from Marjah, from forward surgical tents, from the moment before someone died. She ran. The limp didn't matter. The 3 months of playing invisible didn't matter. Her legs carried her down the hallway faster than a person recovering from spinal injury should have been able to move, and she burst into room for 12 where the first-year resident stood frozen, hands trembling, staring at the blood spreading across the white sheets like spilled coffee. Lieutenant Commander Jason Hayes. Chest wound rupturing. Hemothorax. She saw it in the way his body convulsed, the way his oxygen mask fogged and cleared too rapidly, the way his pressure numbers on the monitor were dropping like a stone thrown into dark water. 80. 70. 60. Get me a scalpel and chest tube from the crash cart now, Rachel said. Not a request. Not a question. Command voice, the kind that made 19-year-old privates move without thinking. The resident jerked into motion. You, bag him, keep oxygen flowing. 1-to-1 ratio. She was already pulling gloves from the box, already prepping the field with betadine that smelled of iodine and urgency. Her hands were steady. Steady as the hands that had held pressure on hemorrhaging abdomens while mortars landed 200 meters away. Steady as the hands that had guided tubes into collapsed airways in tents lit by chemical glow sticks and adrenaline. Call anesthesia and OR. Tell them we're coming up with an open chest. Now. The scalpel cut through skin and muscle with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory older than civilian life. 1 incision. 2. She was inside his chest cavity, her gloved fingers understanding the landscape of blood and tissue the way a blind woman reads Braille, finding the bleeder, a vessel ruptured from the old wound that never fully healed, the Marjah shrapnel that had haunted him for 18 months just like it had haunted her in different ways. Cross clamp. Get me the clamp. Her voice in that room sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone who had authority carved into their spine, someone who had held 16 people alive through sustained fire, someone who was not afraid because fear was a luxury she'd surrendered years ago on a dusty patrol base. She could feel them watching. Through the glass walls. Nurses. Residents. Attendings. The ICU director. Families waiting in the hallway who had stepped back to let the real work happen. She kept her hands moving. 1 minute. 2. 3. Hayes's pressure stabilized at 70. Then 75. His oxygen sat climbed from the high 50s into the low 80s. The bleeding slowed. The clamp held. Trauma team, she said quietly. How long? 90 seconds, the resident whispered. His eyes were wide, shocked, staring at her hands like they belonged to a ghost. 8 minutes. She kept Hayes alive for 8 minutes until the trauma surgeon arrived and took over, until they loaded him onto the stretcher and rushed him toward the operating room. Rachel stepped back, her gloves bloody to the wrist, her scrubs decorated in the language of emergency medicine. The glass walls emptied like reverse osmosis. Everyone stared. She didn't meet their eyes. She was already turning toward the sink, already peeling off the first glove, already separating herself from what had just happened by force of will and practice. The water ran red down the drain. That was when she heard Hayes's voice, fading under sedation. Major Torres, you're here. The words landed in the silence like grenades. 2 hours later, Ashford stood in the break room where Rachel was changing out of bloody scrubs, and his smile was the kind that dogs show before they bite. Congratulations, Ms. Torres. You've just ended your nursing career. She didn't respond. Didn't turn around. Just pulled on the civilian clothes that felt like a costume for someone else's life. You violated protocol. You performed a surgical procedure you're not qualified to perform. You took control of a patient's care without authorization from the attending physician. I have witness statements from 3 residents and 2 nurses. His voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this moment. Your badge is deactivated as of now. Security will escort you from the building. You are terminated effective immediately pending investigation for practicing medicine without a license. The break room door opened and a security guard, young, uncomfortable, looking anywhere but at Rachel's face, waited by the threshold. Rachel touched the dog tag beneath her scrub top. Michael's tag. The one Hayes had pressed into her palm at the funeral. The weight of it was the only real thing left in that moment. Everything else was falling away like ash. She walked past Ashford without speaking. Walked past the gathered staff in the hallway, Linda from the break room who wouldn't meet her eyes, two residents who looked at her with the confusion of people trying to understand what they'd just witnessed, an attending physician who was shaking his head like she'd violated something sacred. The parking lot rain came down hard enough to sting. Portland in winter always rained like it was trying to wash the city clean. Rachel sat in her car for 10 minutes without starting the engine, water streaming down the windshield, her hands still smelling of betadine and Hayes's blood and the kind of failure that tastes like copper and regret. She couldn't save Michael. 18 months ago, an IED in Marjah had taken her son before she could reach him. She'd been 2 minutes away. 2 minutes and the blast had already found him. Hayes had been there. Hayes had held Michael as he died. Rachel had learned that in a red-eyed fog of medical discharge paperwork and grief so profound it felt like drowning while standing in the desert. And tonight, when it had mattered, when Hayes had been the only living link to her son's final moments, when she could have finally done something that meant something, she'd saved his life but lost her career. The math didn't balance. The equation was broken. That night, Cedar Hill Cemetery was empty except for the rain and the ghosts and one woman on her knees in the mud. Rachel's hands were raw from scrubbing. Her scrubs were in a laundry bag in her car. Her badge, deactivated, useless, 3 months of pretending to be invisible stripped away in a single moment when everything she'd buried came roaring back to the surface. David's headstone was wet granite, the dates of his life carved so small they looked like they might disappear in the next rain. 18 years married. 18 years of holding it together while her spine healed and her son grew into a man and her husband drank himself to death trying to forget her. I couldn't save Michael, Rachel whispered to the stone, to the grave, to the rain that hammered down like machine gun fire. And now I can't even save the man who tried to bring him home. I failed, David. I failed them both. She knelt there until the rain had soaked through to her bones, until she was shaking but not from cold, until the grief and the rage and the terrible clarity of what she'd sacrificed came roaring back like it had never actually left. 3 months invisible. 3 months hiding. 3 months of silence. And in a single moment, it had all meant nothing. The rain fell. The cemetery stayed empty. And somewhere in Sacred Heart Hospital, Jason Hayes was in surgery, alive because of hands that had just lost everything. Rachel was in her apartment packing boxes when the sound hit her like a physical force. The rotor wash of 2 Black Hawks descending onto Sacred Heart's rooftop helipad shook the windows hard enough to rattle the glasses in her kitchen cabinet. She froze, hands still wrapped around a roll of packing tape. Military helicopters didn't land at civilian hospitals. Not like this. Not with that precision, the synchronized descent of UH-60MS, the kind of arrival that meant something had changed. Her phone buzzed once. A single message containing only 7 words and a location, Shadowcat, roof, now. Nobody had called her that name in 18 months. Shadowcat. The call sign from her unit, from the life she'd buried in a cardboard box alongside her discharge papers and her major's insignia. The life she'd tried to forget because forgetting was easier than remembering what she'd failed to save. She didn't think. She just moved. The elevator at Sacred Heart took 43 seconds to reach the rooftop. She counted every one of them. Her limp was barely noticeable now, the physical therapist would have been proud. The rotor wash hit her like a wall of heat and noise as the Black Hawk settled, their landing gear kissing the concrete pad with practiced precision. The hospital's night staff stood at the stairwell doors, watching, confused, no one understanding what a SEAL team insertion into Portland General meant. Then the doors burst open in the ICU lobby below, 7 floors down, and Rachel heard her son's voice carry through the entire hospital atrium. Michael Jr., in full dress uniform, service dress blues sharp enough to cut, his voice like a bell tolling through the building. The atrium went quiet. Hundreds of staff, families, patients standing in frozen recognition as a Navy officer in his 20s gripped the microphone of the hospital intercom. "My mother," he said, each word precisely spaced, "is Major Rachel Torres. Bronze Star with Valor. And she just saved a man's life." The tremor started 3 floors below. A nurse, the younger one from the cardiac unit, pulled Rachel's personnel file from the restricted archive with shaking hands. Her voice cracked as she read the citations aloud to the gathering crowd: 2 tours in Afghanistan. 15 commendations. Deployed to Marjah with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines attached to JSOC. Field Surgery Certification. Combat Medical Badge. The file shook in her hands. Medically discharged after catastrophic spinal injury. Recovered through 2 years of rehabilitation. The nurse's voice broke. This woman walked back into combat medicine as a temporary nurse and nobody knew. On the rooftop, Rachel stood motionless as a SEAL team leader descended from the Black Hawk, tall, scarred, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators. Hayes. Still in his dress whites despite the medical discharge. Still alive because of 47 seconds of her hands remembering combat protocols under fire. The team leader's voice came across the hospital radio, transmitted down through every speaker in the building. He named them one by one, each decoration like a piece of evidence, each one landing in front of Dr. Ashford's face in the ICU, where the chief of surgery had summoned him the moment the helicopters appeared. Silver Star for leadership under fire. The team leader's voice was granite. Purple Heart for combat-sustained injuries. He paused, watching Ashford's face drain of color through the glass. Combat Medical Badge for surgical interventions in contested territory. Another pause. The surgical officer who held a field hospital operational for 16 consecutive hours under direct fire in Marjah, 2011. Rachel's hands didn't shake. They never shook anymore. The FBI agents arrived 42 minutes later. They didn't announce themselves. They walked past Rachel where she stood in the rooftop stairwell, nodded with the kind of recognition that came from checking a box on a briefing memo, and descended to the ICU where Dr. Ashford had begun pacing like a caged animal. The medication logs had been flagged 72 hours earlier, a routine audit that became anything but routine when the pattern emerged. Unlabeled vials. Veterinary pharmaceutical supply connections. 17 deaths in 18 months. Elderly patients with substantial life insurance policies. Each documented as natural complications. Each one a careful erasure of evidence. The handcuffs were quiet, just a soft click of steel meeting steel. Ashford's face went the color of old institutional paint. Rachel watched from the railing as they led him down the corridor, past the nurse's station where the staff stood in absolute silence. He looked up once, searching for her, and she was there. Standing with her dress uniform jacket draped over her scrubs, her major's insignia bright as a lighthouse, her son beside her with his arm around her shoulders. Hayes watched from his gurney in the corner room, the one with the view of the Portland skyline. Watching her. Watching Ashford understand that the woman he'd tried to destroy was the woman who'd saved him. That he'd gambled everything against someone who'd already survived the worst that human violence could inflict, and he'd lost catastrophically. "Thank you," Hayes said when she knelt beside his bed, and those 2 words carry the weight of a graveside funeral 18 months earlier, carry the weight of a Navy SEAL holding a dying soldier and promising his mother he'd try to bring him home. Rachel didn't speak. She just placed her hand over his and let him see the dog tag on its broken chain. The one he'd given her at Michael's funeral. The one she'd worn beneath her scrubs every shift, every single shift. 6 months later, she stood in the county courthouse wearing her dress uniform, watching the jury return with the kind of solemn certainty that meant finality. 14 counts of murder. 3 counts of attempted murder. Life without parole. Ashford's attorney had argued incompetence, medical errors, not malice. The prosecution had presented Rachel's incident report, the one she'd tried to file before Ashford restricted her access. They presented the systematic exclusion, the break room exile, the public humiliation. They presented consciousness of guilt displayed with precision and calculation. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Rachel sat in the gallery in full dress uniform, watching Ashford's shoulders collapse as the verdict was read. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just the terrible clarity of someone who understood that justice was paperwork and proceedings, and healing was something that happened privately, alone, on the kind of night when the rain wouldn't stop. At the door, Ashford turned and looked at her. She took one measured breath. Wiped away a single tear that had no right to be there. Met his eyes with that same quiet dignity he'd tried to break. He flinched first. He always did. Then she walked away, and that was the end of Dr. Ashford. 6 months after that, a year and 3 weeks after she'd walked out of Sacred Heart with security escorting her from the building, Rachel stopped in a strip mall in southeast Portland. A vape shop on one corner. A tax preparer on the other. In between, a folding table with a handwritten sign, "Insurance, cheap rates." Ashford sat behind it in a wrinkled polo shirt, his medical license permanently revoked, his assets seized for victim restitution, reduced to selling cut-rate policies to people with bad credit and worse luck. His probation officer required him to maintain employment. This was employment. He saw her and his face drained of color like someone had opened a valve. Rachel didn't move. She just stood there, letting him see her hospital badge clipped to her jacket, Chief of Trauma Education, Sacred Heart Hospital. Letting him see the dog tag on its steel chain. Letting him see exactly who he'd tried to destroy and what she'd become while he was losing everything. One measured breath. Then she turned and walked away with quiet dignity, her limp barely noticeable anymore. Sacred Heart's new trauma simulation center opened the following week. The plaque at the entrance read, Major Rachel Torres Combat Medicine Training Center, in honor of those who served twice. Rachel taught residents every Tuesday and Thursday morning, teaching them the protocols she'd learned in Marjah, the muscle memory that lived in her hands, the kind of decision-making that only came from having already looked death in the face and refused to blink. Michael Jr. came with his family, 3 grandchildren she hadn't known she had time to meet. Hayes sent a SEAL team photo with a handwritten note, Shadowcat, still saving lives. Still a legend. She pinned it to her office wall beside her silver star. The box of buried insignia stayed unpacked now. Her uniform hung in her office closet for the days she taught. No longer hidden. No longer silent. Finally home. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If Rachel's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible, underestimated, buried beneath assumptions, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, have you ever been judged by someone who had no idea who they were actually standing next to? I want to hear your story.